Ladies and gentlemen, namaskar, good morning. A very warm welcome to the 16th edition of Jaipur Literature Festival, produced by Dettol, Banega Swasth India at the Darbar Hall. We are delighted to introduce Agyeya, Nirmal Verma, Those Days, Within. In the session, we have Akshaya Mukul, Vineet Gill in conversation with Pragya Tiwari, and musical rendition by Vidya Shah. Pioneers of modernism Hindi literature, Nirmal Verma and Agyeya, were both in contact with European literary traditions in the 1940s and 50s, but decided to chart their own innovations in their mother tongue. Nirmal Verma's first novel, Within, captures his student days in Prague and the beginnings of self-questioning. Agyeya traveled to Japan and later to Europe and America, always experimenting with new forms of writing. Nai Kahani is the gift of Verma, and Nai Kavita is Agyeya's legacy. Akshaya Mukul and Vineet Gill will discuss how these stalwarts change the direction of Hindi literature in conversation with Pragya Tiwari. We first welcome Akshaya Mukul on stage. Akshaya Mukul is an independent researcher and writer. He is a recipient of Homi Bhabha, Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Fund, and New India Foundation fellowships. His latest book is Writer, Rebel, Soldier, Lover, The Many Lives of Agyeya. Vineet Gill is a writer and works as a senior editor at Penguin Random House, India. His essays have appeared in various Indian and international publications. He is the author of Here and Hereafter, Nirmal Verma's Life in Literature, published by Penguin in 2022. Pragya Tiwari is creative director of Oijo Media and co-founder of the India History Collective. As a journalist, she has written extensively on politics, identity policy, and culture, and has edited several publications, including Tehlka, The Big Indian Picture, and Vice. Vidya Shah is trained in Carnatic music and in Khayal, Thumri, Dadra, and Ghazal. She has performed at national and international forums and is a recipient of the Charles Wellis Award and a senior fellowship from the Government of India, based for her project Women on Record, a performance highlighting the contributions of the forgotten women performance in the gramophone era. So over to Pragya for this beautiful session.
I don't know if I'm audible, but it's not over to Pragya to start the session, it's over to Vidya to start the session. Good morning. I will be presenting a verse written by Agyeya. Before I sing, just to say that singing Agyeya's work is a bit of a challenge. It's not the easiest in meter or, for that matter, in verse. But I'm grateful to Akshay for having pushed me into exploring this. This kavita is called Chale Chalo Odho. Chale chalo धो चले चलो धो यहाँ न मिली है माधो यहाँ न मिली है माधो अच्छा है इस वृंदावन नंद ग्राम मथुरा में मरना और उधर वहाँ दूर द्वारका पार फिर उभरना दम साधो अब चले चलो धो और गहरे गमीर में कूदो.
Thank you, Vidya, for setting such a beautiful note for this conversation. I'm just going to assume most of you here are familiar with who Agyeya and Nirmal Verma are. But just in short, very, very short, they are two giants of literature, Hindi literature in particular, and they are, amongst many other things, credited with sort of changing the tenor and of Hindi literature, modernizing it, if you will, which is a very elusive term. So that's what I want to really start with. Akshay, first of all, congratulations on the book. It's absolutely spectacular. Both books are really absolutely spectacular, and I can say this straight away, right off the bat, that no conversation we have here will do it any justice, will do either of the books any justice. So please go out there, buy the books, and read them for yourself. But talking about modernism and Agyeya, right from the very start, when he's a very young man, right, he is steeped in the tradition of Hindi literature. He has mentors, he's having conversations, but when he writes Shekhar Ek Jeevni, he's in jail, Nadi Ke Dweep, and then so on. What is it that he is really bringing to the table? How is he really beginning to change something, ferment something within what is at that point the norm of Hindi literature?
Thank you, Pragya. See, Agya is a restless man. His homeschool boy who has read everything at home. It's a father's great library he had access to, and he was reading everything in the language, so with Sanskrit or Persian or English or everything. So there is a bit of restless. Even before he started writing, you find when he is in Madras, he's telling people, his friends, he's writing to, I think, even his father, saying that, look, that there has to be something beyond Premchand. That's a era of Premchand. Premchand is the most dominant character of here, is the personality of Hindi literature, and this whole thing of a writer taking the burden of the society. So he's moving away from that. There's a restlessness. He's reading it. He's liking them, but he wants to do something more. And jail gives him that thing, and when he starts writing Shekhar Ek Jeevni in jail, first with a very different title called Usantarir, which was a very Bangla word, and so he moves away completely from this whole. So it's a psychoanalytical novel. It's deeply inner, it's psychological novels, Shekhar Ek Jeevni, and so his modernism comes from there. And it's not that his modernism is kind of confined to writing novel. It's even in poetry. By 44, he has done something remarkable. He has come up with this first collaborative exercise called Tar Saptak, where he gets 7 poets, 5 of them who are Marxists, who don't like him, but they're great poets, and he brings them together, and then he continues with Dusra Saptak, Tisra Saptak, and by Tisra Saptak the quality goes down definitely, but first 2 Saptaks are. So his modernism is coming from there, and this also from the world literature. He's reading a lot. At times, as a 19-year-old, when he's in jail and when he's writing to Jainendra, who was senior to him, and he's telling Jainendra where to get what book. So, all that comes together in his modernism, restlessness with what was happening in India, what was happening in the world literature stage, everything. And this modernism, if you get to see, he carries it even to journalism. He becomes editor. He's not the editor, but he's running the show in Sainik, which is an Agra-based weekly newspaper. And one of the first things he does, the kind of people he gets, the kind of issues which gets written about in Sainik. It was basically Congress mouthpiece, but he brings new elements, features. He introduces M.N. Roy. M.N. Roy gets published in Hindi, probably the first time in Sainik, and they had met together during peasant movement in Western UP, where M.N. Roy was traveling a lot after jail. So this is his kind of modernism. And in journalism, even subsequent, after Sainik, you see Bisal Bharat, what is he doing? Then Naya Pratik comes, again, a lot of new things are happening. And when Dinman, which is kind of his really big moment in journalism, you see on environment, one of the earliest writing on environment in Hindi, or even it was not even happening in English those days in the 60s. He introduced the Chandi Prasad Bhatt, Sundar Lal Bagunas of the world, everyone. And Chandi Prasad Bhatt told me that, had it not been for Agyeya, I would have never written on environment, on anything. So, and women's issues, everything. So his modernism comes from influences all around him, what was happening in the world. So, and it was not confined to literature.
We'll talk a little bit more about the confluences and influences, but I want to take this question to you, Vineet. We think of Nai Kahani, Nai Kavita when we think of Agyeya and Nirmal Verma. And this khitab of Nai Kahani was, of course, given to his work by one of the leading critics of that time, Nambar Singh Ji. It's something that he sort of has a difficult relationship with, this phrase, Nirmal Verma. But it is a new kind of story. Of course it is, right? I mean, again, like Akshay was saying, you're moving away from the message being the central point to more sort of visuals, aesthetics. It's cosmopolitan setting. It's somewhat inward looking. It's, like maybe perhaps even autobiographical. So what is it that Nirmal Verma is doing? What is he building on? And how do, looking from this vantage point, what are the elements that he brings in that really change the scope of what can be done with Hindi literature forever?
So you use the word modernism, and I was thinking about modern artists and musicians who basically had a better idea of what they did not want to do, and they were clueless about what they actually wanted to do. So, Picasso painted a certain style and then rejected it in favor of something else. Some musician like Schoenberg does the same. He rejects the whole of music and seeks out to explore atonality in music. So this aesthetic of rejection has always been important for modern writers and artists across the world. Verma was influenced by that, and Verma excites me still because of that. You mentioned the dominant orthodoxy of Agyeya's time, Premchand, and when Verma was coming of age as a writer, the dominant figure was Agyeya. So he wanted to do nothing of the sort. His approach, he wanted to keep very different from Agyeya's approach. So he operated not in the epic mode as Agyeya did. He was not interested in the psychoanalytical novel, for instance. He was not interested in a lot of stuff that Agyeya ended up doing, writing plays, poems. Verma never wrote poems, except when he was a kid. So he had a very clear idea of what he did not want to do. And now what he wanted to do will come. That's the difficult question. And you asked me what contribution he made to the language and to Hindi literature as such. I think Nai Kahani, the tag that was attributed to him, Namvar Singh and others, he rejected it because, again, he loved to reject things and tags and affiliations. And he did the other thing as well. He wanted to build alliances as well. But they were kind of unexpected. He drew more inspiration from some writer like Virginia Woolf, who was at that point who was not as famous as she might now be because of the feminist discourse, etc. So he was making those discoveries, and when Parinde, was hailed as the Nai Kahani in Hindi. He said that he had a problem with the others who were clubbed with him, and he said those stories aren't new enough. The problem is that they are not at all new. They're doing the same old thing. So Verma's approach, I'll tell you, he came up with the phrase "Antarik Yatharthvad" in opposition to Agye's psychoanalysis and in opposition to Premchand's Adarshwadi Yatharthvad. You know. And he was interested in exploring the role memory plays in creation. You know, that was one of his sort of lifelong subjects. He had a lovely phrase somewhere. He says that when memory calls out to experience, that's when art is born. You know, so he was interested more in exploring images, in exploring moments. You know, in again capturing a moment in a sentence. That's been a modernist preoccupation for a very long time. So Verma, I guess, was drawing from these artists, mostly Europeans and poets and novelists, who who you know as a Hindi, when I was approaching Hindi for the first time as a reader, when I was approaching Hindi literature, I was surprised that there could be room for someone like Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher, in a Hindi novella. That a novella can open with someone like Walter Benjamin. So these were the alliances he formed, and then you know there were others that he rejected.
I mean, just very quickly, because this idea of these confluences is so interesting, at least to me. And no true moment of modernism can be, I mean, no moment of modernism can really be authentic if it is not both steeped in its own tradition as well as drawing from everywhere else. A little bit more, Akshay, about these exchanges that Agyeya is also having with the world, right? I mean, he mentioned Wolf, and then there was also Tagore, I believe, for Nirmal Verma. But what is, and Agyeya is, I mean, at some point moved by the Spanish Civil War, and but of course he has mentors back here. Bengali literature, like you said, is a big. So can you talk a little bit about what's in the soil for this moment of modernism?
Yeah, he is kind of very much early years. If you see early years in the means first 2 decades of Agge, you find he's very influenced. T.S. Eliot, for instance, is highly influenced by T.S. Eliot, Proust to a large extent, and a lot of this, some of this very, there's a silence about, say, the 60s and the 50s American poets who were making it big. For instance, William Carlos Williams or Anne Sexton or Sylvia Plath. He doesn't talk, but then he is very interested in someone like Josephine Miles. Josephine Miles is the one who introduced this famous beat poet. Allen Ginsberg. He introduced Allen Ginsberg to the world and got him published by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. He's influenced by that, but later on, almost after 2 decades, a strange sense of Indianness grips in Agge, and he's reading a lot Indian texts, sacred texts, religious texts. A lot of these texts he's reading, he's drawing from them, and he also changes into this whole thing of that you should write only in your Indian language. One should write in your mother tongue. And he gave this long interview to the Duke University archives where he told Mr. Sonak that and Sonak gave him example of Vladimir Nabokov. He says, "Don't give me example of an exception; it only proves my rule." You know, so and it became kind of a very hardened position, and then we see subsequently in the late 70s onwards, he's moving further towards tradition and all that. So there were like many a guess, so there were many kinds of influences. In fact, Vineet was talking about this whole how Nirmal Verma tried to be a little different from Agyeya, and so in fact there's a famous fight which once happened in the house of I think Nemichand Jain, that Nirmal Verma asked Agyeya, why is it? Because Agye's novels also footnoted, you know. He footnotes his novels also. And he says, why everything that you have to say goes through someone's house? Why can't you say it? Why do you rely on this or that, on everything? And it becomes little ugly, actually. And it's very well written by this whole episode by Mohan Rakesh in his memoirs. So there were, Agye's influences were changing, but some remained forever. Eliot never kind of went away from his one way or the other, and he kept getting back to Eliot. Yeah.
Sorry, just I actually wanted to talk about this earlier, but because it's come up, this relationship with Hindi is very, very interesting again, right? I mean, he is somebody who is actually, when he starts out, or perhaps for the rest of his life, he's not seen as a Hindi wala because of a certain class stature that he's coming from. Um, he doesn't dress like the rest of them. Of course, these are generalizations, but by and large, that's his perception. He's also interacting with the world so much. He wants to be read, he wants to be translated. He's talking to everybody across the world. And yet, at some point, he's beginning to take this very hardened position about Hindi being, sort of the dominant language of expression. Is it something that's sort of reactionary? I mean, or is it something or is it truly ideological? I mean, I wonder where this is really coming from.
This is Agay at, simple explanation is this is Agay at his contradictory best. He's contradicting himself all the time. So here is a man who insists on writing in Hindi, but here is also a man who wants the world to read him. And he goes out of the way, and that's how he makes friends like Leonard Nathan or Gordon Rodamal. These are like big American names, and he's Josephine Miles. See, he makes Josephine Miles and all translate Nirala, and many other poets. So he's also here in the Indiana University Press brought out the first anthology of Hindi poets. So this is a bit contradiction, but then he was also drawing from a lot of the European poets who were writing in German, and Hans Magnus Enzensberger was his friend, and he's constantly telling him that, look, I get read in the English world writing in German, right? So through translation. So, but you can see it as a contradiction. You can see it as a reactionary, that he's against being reactionary. Also, because the whole world is trying to tell him, no, don't do this, and he also has to do things which is very different. And he creates a whole tribe of Indian writers, Hindi writers, who he wants to get Dinkar, he convinces Dinkar to get translated. Many of Dinkar's poems came up for translation in that anthology. Even Namwar Singh was very young then, and Namwar's poems are there, part of that. Someone who always attacked him. So, yeah, this is at best, yeah, his contradictory self, his reactionary self, everything put together. Yeah.
I think
Sorry, Vineet.
I'll,
Actually,
I'll
I was
add
just
to
going
it.
to ask you the
I
same
mean,
question.
I think a lot of Hindi writers at the time felt very, very protective of of Hindi. They felt for the language, and they correctly thought that this was a marginalized kind of a literary language that needed preservation, that needed support. So in Verma's case, he spent a lot of time in the former Czechoslovakia, in Prague, befriending many Czech writers and translating them. Verma learned Czech in Prague and translated a lot of modern Czech fiction into Hindi. So Milan Kundera became available in Hindi before he became available in English. It was a strange time. It was a very strange era of this kind of a very different kind of cosmopolitanism that we've lost now, right? So Verma spoke with writers like Ivan Klima and asked them what they felt about writing in a kind of a marginalized language in Europe. The central language being German or English or French. And so some of the ideas about language, of the politics of language, Verma derived from his experience in Czechoslovakia. And although he was very, of course, he was more open than Agyeya, I think, when it came to, say, writing as an Indian writer in English. Agyeya was rather dismissive of Indian writing in
That was
English.
very dismissive.
Yeah.
Someone asked him, I think, St. Stephen's College English department had those journal those days, and they asked him, and he's saying, someone mentioned Raja Roy. He said, oh, he doesn't know English. Mulk Raj Anand was his friend. He said, no, not so good. Kuswant Singh. He dismissed the whole. So I was very curious. In '86, a year before he died, Aghay was in Frankfurt, and that's also there when Salman Rushdie was there, and he had just won. His Midnight Children was a sensation. I tried my best to look into the archives of the Frankfurt Book Fair. Somehow I didn't. I was even looking for a picture, if at all, because India was a lead country that year. but I couldn't find. It would have been very interesting to know what Agyeya thought of Salman Rushdie. Yeah.
No, sorry, very quickly, I want to move on from this, but obviously these are complex issues because also Verma is, writing many more stories are set in an Anglophone world. It's more cosmopolitan setups. English finds its way into dialogues, he makes it look easy, but obviously there must have been a lot of paddling going on under the surface in terms of trying to figure out what his politics of languages. But I also want to move on to a broader framework of politics, right? I mean, we started with saying that Agye's one of Agye's reactions was that आदर्शवाद से परे अगर वो लिखना चाहते थे कि this is not, it's not for the artist to bear constantly the burden of social change, but at the same time he's a deeply political mind. I mean, he is very close to Nehru, is part of Congress, he becomes a revolutionary, he goes to jail. He eventually then joins the British Army. He's attacked by the left and the right, accused of being a CIA spy. And then, of course, also tries to say that his writing has nothing to do with ideology. How do you square? How do you make sense of his political consciousness and writing?
Agyeya is the first free thinker of the Hindi world, definitely. So, a revolutionary of the 1920s, goes to jail, spent 4 years, joins British Army, and everyone is amazed. And that point, Agyeya says that, other writers are only taking positions. I'm taking a position, I'm joining the army also. He tells his lover, then Kripa Sen, he writes a long letter to her, and she tells him only fools and morons go to army. Why will you, a writer like you, take orders? He says, no, I have to go, I have to work. The same man, so revolutionary, then he joins this, then he becomes part of that Congress for Cultural Freedom, which is CIA funded. By 60s, Agyeya is saying it's not a writer's job to bring revolution. When he's going for the war, he's telling his lover that no, it's writer's job to do it. So Agyeya continues with this contradiction. Later on, he becomes very, very kind of convinced that it's not a writer's job. So they asked this, Professor Sonak asked, then how do you want to be remembered as? He says, I want to be remembered as an anarchist. And he said, if anyone I was very close to, he remained close to, was M.N. Roy. M.N. Roy was his kind of ideological mentor. They got along very well, both M.N. Roy and his wife Ellen, everyone. So, and later on, but he flirted with socialists. He was close to JP, bit with Lohia. But so much so that when he was editing Dinman, I think Indira Gandhi complained to the Jains saying that why are socialists always on the cover of Dinman? And later on, he of course put Indira Gandhi also on cover. So yeah, so this was Agyeya, like freewheeling, free thinker, and changing positions, contradictions. But that's what makes him fascinating also,
Um, so it's possible for a writer, that's what Verma maybe teaches us, I don't know. But I think all writers kind of teach us that. You say Agyeya was the first free mind in Hindi, but I think we can even go back to Premchand and, look at some of his work, how the same, the story written by the same person can undermine an essay or sort of a manifesto written by Premchand. So what Premchand is doing, for instance, in Kafan, the story, which Verma wrote about very movingly, and he says this is the birth of free man in Hindi, in Kafan. It completely undermines everything Premchand sort of prescribes to young writers in his very famous Sahitya Ka Uddeshya speech, progressive speech. So, and Premchand, I came across a story by Premchand which is written from the point of view of a door. It predates, absurdism, European absurdism by I don't know how many decades. So just imagine that Premchand himself was interested in various modes of literary expression. And you didn't have to be the same kind of political thinker when writing about that door, writing a story from the point of view of a door or a goat, which Premchand also did. So there are various modes and various keys on which every writer has to operate, even within the same work. So when we ask for this kind of consistency, that be sort of stridently political in everything you do, that's an impossible ideal. Now, Verma was a deeply political writer. He was among the very, few handful of writers who witnessed the Prague Spring and the aftermath and the Soviet invasion in 1968 at first hand, and wrote a brilliant book about it called Har Barish Mein, which is not considered among his major works, but it's just fabulous, and it's really it's a great example of how, a unique example of how an outsider can write like an insider with a lot of tenderness about a complete different culture. It comes from that cosmopolitan ethos that the Hindi world was informed by. So, as a political writer, also when he returned to India, he marched with Phanishwanath Renu in Delhi, anti-emergency marches. And back in the day, Verma did a lot of volunteer work in the wake of partition, a lot of relief work. So he's considered this kind of an aesthete, remote from the real world, but he was very, very engaged, and he had very firm political opinions but they don't necessarily reflect in everything he did.
You mentioned cosmopolitanism now as part of two of your answers. I want to ask you, Akshay, first, and then of course you, that during the course of researching these lives, what are the sort of things that struck you about the larger Hindi sphere, and also about the sort of larger swath of cultural moment in which these people are operating? So if we can start with Agyeya and then
Yeah.
Varma.
See, it's Hindi world, right from the Agyeya comes in the very young age when Premchand publishes him when he's in jail. One thing becomes very clear, and which has not changed till now, is pettiness. They are great people, grand debates also happening, but there is immense pettiness also happening. And someone like Agge is facing it a lot, also because he's trying to turn a new leaf in literature. So when uh, his first novel comes out, when he's kind of showing it to people like this one, Banarsi Das Chaturbedi and others, everyone is kind of not very convinced. They say it's an exceptional novel, but they're not very convinced. So, and that continues with Agge. And Agge gets that extra love from his enemies. They're always at him. So when it comes with Sekhar Ek Jibni, Hindi Sahitya Sammelan even has a kind of a meeting where they say we'll ban it. Even when Tar Saptak comes, they say, there's a lot of obscenity. There are some obscene poems, which are not Agge's poems, I guess someone else's. It has to be banned. And when Nadi Ke Dweep comes in 1952, you find that even before the novel has hit the stands, Namwar Singh is writing to one of the leading Marxist critics those days, Shivraj Singh Chauhan, saying that, look, his novel is coming. Now we have to get together to attack it. And he uses the Hindi word, एक हाथ से काम नहीं चलेगा, मतलब और लोगों को इसमें लगना. So Agge faces, but mind you, in the midst of all these grand debates happening, there is a great deal of civility also. It's not that they're not talking to each other. Shivraj Singh Chauhan is talking to Agge. Agge is talking to him. They're attacking. There is one big fight which happens between Agge and Kedarnath Agarwal. Agge basically fights with everyone. So he's fighting with Banarsi Das Chaturvedi, who was his mentor. He falls out with Jainendra Kumar, who was his mentor. Later, Nemi Chand Jain, and everyone. And like it all happens with great writers, great poets and painters. In the last 10 years, he becomes a messiah, a prophet, and surrounds himself with super mediocre people. None of them are good, you know.
Verma was a fighter as well in the
Yeah,
same sense.
yeah,
Verma was a great committed fighter as well in
yeah.
this sense.
Burma
But
also
but
faced that.
this
Yeah, no.
but this was part of the spirit of that age. I miss that also, although I never sort of experienced it myself. But reading about it and so on. So the milieu that we both written about and what we're talking about here was very different from what we have now. Verma's brother Ram Kumar was a painter and a writer who published before Verma did, and was a major writer, considered a major writer, who experimented with literary forms much as he experimented with the visual form. So it was possible. It was a time of possibility. It was possible to do everything at the same time. So writer had that. Writers were never just writers. Agyeya was a photographer.
Yeah,
Agyeya was a great photographer.
Great photographer, yeah.
So you would experiment. We were just talking about Kumar Gandharv, who was an admirer of Agyeya. So there was not such segmentation that you're a novelist, you're a writer, and then you're a musician. Everyone, Swaminathan Hussain was a friend of Nirmal
Nirmal
Verma's
Verma,
close
great
friend.
friend, yeah.
He campaigned for Hussain in support of him, which is an important detail when he's accused of being a sort of a right-wing, a rabid right-wing. That's not true. So this was a different age. This was a different age, and it it ended, and it was a cusp moment. It felt like the cusp moment, even when you read Verma's letters and essays from the 80s, say late 70s. He can see it sort of vanishing, that world. Um, uh, you know, the Times of India, Raghuveer Sahai was editing it at one point, one of the magazines of the Times of India.
Dinman, he was editing
Yeah.
Dinman.
And they did a short story issue on world literature. This is in the late 70s. And Heinrich Boll and others, writers that are out of the discourse, literary discourse, they were all published, and there was an abiding interest in all these things, So Sontag's definition of a writer was someone interested in everything. And they sort of lived up to that definition, a lot of them, even though they were selective. It didn't mean that whatever you gave them, they absorbed it. They were selective, observant, and yet very open-minded. And that's the kind of world that we seem to have lost.
No, that exchange between the arts is, of course, fascinating. But you spoke about the fights, and one of my favorite things about the book that you've written is how you contextualize the great Mukti Bodh and Agyeya, clash of titans, really. But while enjoying that endlessly, I was also wondering that is it voyeuristic or is it something that is necessary? And I wonder how you draw that line, right? You obviously have to write a lot about. This is a constant battle, I imagine, for biographers, right? In terms of not making it hagiographic, how much the personal informs the work. Is it important? Is it not important? How did you make those choices, Akshay?
See, my standard rule is, for this book I did around 60 interviews, and I used only two, one with Krishna Sopti and a little bit of Namwar Singh and some bit of Kuan Narayan. I realized that a lot of people were trying to fix Agya even after his death. Okay, so I realized it very early. So I was going just by the archive. I was lucky to get the archives, but there were still many gaps, especially about talking about his love life. So a lot of it was there. I failed to convince Kapila Vatsyayan to talk to me, and later on she said that you just don't understand love. It doesn't end with a man walking out of the house, and it's never asked. So my thing was, and everyone who's read the book has said you've been very unkind to Agya when it comes to women, and you've been very kind to women. It's because you see thread that runs in all his relations with women is that they're all miserable in relationship with him. He makes them miserable. His first wife, second wife, his partner, who becomes a complete wreck. You know, his last partner. Everyone is a wreck with Agya. But what is it about him? You know, 2 days back I was discussing this with Agya's nephew, who's here. Yeah, he's here. And nobody kind of has figured this out. So I was very cautious. And otherwise, my thing is don't brush anything under the carpet. If there is record, write about it. Thing is that don't make him a god. He's not a god. Humanize him. See, he had his battle. He was petty when he wanted to be. He was petty with people. He did went out of the way to attack people. So they were all, and that what makes again. Yet I like him for his writing. That doesn't take away my liking for a guy just because he was petty with something. What happened with this women? I had to be very careful with that. And thankfully, there was enough evidence of what he was doing to women. He was making them miserable. And so I just went about that. There is all biographers are warriors at some level. So maybe even I am.
I'm not. Yes.
I know.
Because I did not write a biography. So I've sort of made it clear in the book. kind of repeatedly that this is not a biography. So what I'm doing is very different from what Akshay has done. Um, this was my idea was to kind of there's a whole chapter in my book about the biography, about my reluctance to sort of uh, dive deep into Varma's life, the life details, and sort of pull something out and display it to the audience. I didn't want to do that because I wanted to explore the limits of the biography form, and I wanted to sort of slightly challenge the form. It's a kind of a polemical book that I've done, and yet I wanted to explore ways of writing about writers and writing, that is, ways that are not biographical. Are there other modes that we can operate on? So, in a sense, Akshay's book and mine are kind of in opposition to each other, you know. Um, by the way, I should say that I proofread Akshay's book as well. I have a role to play, So, what I was thinking is that it was a challenge for me because I was working in a kind of a virtual sort of a vacuum, because there were no archives in my case. Well, Agyeya was the sort of writer who was waiting for a biographer like Akshay because every detail of his life is documented. He left a dream journal. How many writers in India have left a dream journal? Everything is documented and kept somewhere, so for the biographer to discover the stash. Varma hid himself. Even in his, although he said that my work is my autobiography once to an interviewer, it's not. There's a lot of artifice in that. There's a lot of sort of, a lot of hiding. And so he's also the sort of writer that you can't really write a biography about because he didn't leave a lot of sort of a detailed record of his day. His diary, which is among his best books, it's called Dhun Se Utti Dhun, is not really a diary. It's a creative work, it's like a novel. You can call it that. It's a series of fragments in that. It's a brilliant book, really. So my book, I want it still to be considered as a creative work, a book about writing, and a book about how a writer is kind of formed. And, to a limited extent, you need to know a little bit about the life of the writer, and I've attempted to do that. And then kind of try to focus on not just his work, but the works of other writers like Woolf and Sontag and Benjamin that he was reading, and try to kind of link these, So that's the basic difference.
It struck me while reading both your books that in so many ways the form almost was derived as a tribute to the writers themselves. I mean, that would be the Agyeya biography with lots of footnotes and many pages, and this would be. But we have very little time. Maybe I can take one or two questions. Are there any questions in the audience? Shdeep, but I'll just, okay, so we have two questions. I can really only take two, keep them as brief as possible. Can we start here, please? Yes, that is how we intend to end the. That's the reason we need to keep this short.
One of the things that constantly comes up is the fact that both these writers, amongst many, many writers, are not praised for their inconsistency. Now, isn't inconsistency a hallmark of personal growth? Because if you are fossilized and you're producing the same sort of echo chamber kind of work, then it will be kind of self-defeating in any case. And that's the thing that is not highlighted, not in your books per se, but in general discussion, I find that should be lauded, that you're able to grow, able to dissent, and so on and so forth. So perhaps you both have something to add to that.
No, I agree with you entirely. Well, Gandhi was constantly evolving. If someone, I remember in the 1920s, this Gita Press editor told him that, oh, once upon a time you were against interdining or temple entry for untouchables. Now you are kind of in favor of that. So again, Gandhi says, look, I'm constantly evolving. Same is the case of Agyeya. Well, it happens to all of us. All of us, when someone throws what we thought about certain things 20 years back, oh, well, I'll not recognize that Akshay at all. So all of us are doing that. And biography, as you rightly pointed out, should kind of point that out, celebrate it, rather make it a kind of, negative thing. Yeah.
No, this is a, Yeah, so many. I was thinking of Whitman's great, sort of famous quote, "I contain multitudes."
Which
So yeah,
Agyeya constantly quoted. Every time someone asked him, he said, I contain multitudes. This is
yeah.
like his
And that's what
quote.
personally I'm drawn to that. I'm drawn to writers who are inconsistent in their thinking and the grappling, and you can see that kind of that grappling on the page, you know. And the essay is one of my favorite forms because of that, because there's a lot of room to be inconsistent and draw to a conclusion that is unrelated to what you started with. Though those are the best pieces.
I was hoping to take two questions, but we're down to 5 minutes, and I'll hand the mic over to Vidya. Both Akshay and Vineet will be signing books, so if you have more questions, you can take them up with them later. Over to you, Vidya.
This poem is titled Dhundli Chandni, and it's very beautiful how he describes what Chandni can do. So in the first verse he says Nehla gayi Chandni. Then he says Sehla gayi Chandni. Then he says Behla gayi. And finally he says Chetna par chha gayi. So the play of how चांदनी है धुंधली लेकिन कितना कुछ कर जाती है. So दिन छिपे मलिना गए थे रूप उनको चांदनी नहला गई दिन छिपे मलिना गए थे रूप थक गई थी यार हाँ थक गई थी यार संकुल लोक में उमड़ती धुंध फिर सहला गई उनको चांदनी नहला गई बोझ से दब घुट रही थी भावना बोझ से दब घुट रही थी भावना पर प्रकृतियों बहला गई उनको चांदनी नहला गई फिर सलोने मांग तेरी कसमसाती चेतना पर छा गई फिर सलोने मांग तेरी कसमसाती चेतना पर छा गई थक गई थी याद बोझ से दब घुट रही थी भावना दिन छिपे मलिना गए थे रूप उनको चांदनी नहला गई नहला
नहला गई।
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Vidya. Thank you, Akshay. Thank you, Vineet. And thank you, all of you. Just a reminder, books are available and they'll be signing them.
It's
Thank
a
you.
big round of applause for this most melodious session. We would like to thank Akshaya Mukul, Vineet Gill, Pragya Tiwari, and Vidya Shah. We thank ABP for their support in supporting this session. And please subscribe to Jaipur Literature Festival YouTube channel so that you can watch other sessions which you have missed out by being here or by attending.